Detective Mike Rodriguez here, 32 years with the NYPD, and I've seen cases that would make your blood run cold. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what started as a routine kidnapping call on that rainy Tuesday night in October. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m., jolting me from the mountain of paperwork I was drowning in at my desk in the Major Crimes Unit. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with that familiar hum that had become the soundtrack to my late nights. At the precinct, Detective Rodriguez, we've got a kidnapping in progress. Manhattan, Upper East Side, Park Avenue, and 68th Street. The voice belonged to Dispatch Officer Sarah Chen, and I could hear the urgency cutting through her usually calm, professional demeanor like a knife through silk. I grabbed my badge from the desk drawer, holstered my service weapon, checked my radio, and headed into the night that would unravel one of the most twisted, psychologically complex cases of my entire career. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the city streets into rivers of reflected neon and making visibility nearly impossible. As I drove through the empty streets toward the crime scene, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case was going to be different from the dozens of kidnappings I'd worked over the years. There was something in Sarah's voice, a tension that suggested this wasn't going to be a straightforward ransom situation. The victim was Marcus Thompson, 42 years old, successful investment banker with Sterling and Associates, married with 2 kids, living the American dream in a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. According to the initial report that crackled through my radio, he'd been grabbed outside his office building on Park Avenue around 9:30 p.m. by what witnesses described as 3 masked figures who moved with military precision. Security cameras caught fragments of the abduction, showing the perpetrators forcing him into a black SUV with tinted windows so dark they were probably illegal. The license plate was obscured, naturally, covered with what appeared to be mud or some kind of adhesive material. His wife, Jennifer Thompson, had called it in when he failed to come home for their usual dinner at 10 p.m. and wasn't answering. His phone, which she said was completely out of character for a man who lived by his schedule and never missed a family obligation. She was frantic when I arrived at their penthouse apartment, pacing the marble floors like a caged animal, her designer heels clicking against the stone with each anxious step. "He's never late without calling," she kept repeating, ringing her hands until her knuckles turned white. "Something terrible has happened, I know it. Marcus is the most punctual person I've ever known. He calls if he's going to be 5 minutes late, let alone 2 hours." The apartment was immaculate, the kind of place you see in architectural magazines, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city that never sleeps. Family photos lined the mantelpiece above a fireplace that probably cost more than most people's cars, showing Marcus and Jennifer at various social events, vacations in Europe, their 2 children's school graduations. It was the picture of success, stability, and happiness, which made the current situation all the more jarring. Asterisk in kidnapping cases. Every detective knows that the first 48 hours are absolutely crucial, the golden window where statistics show we have the best chance of bringing the victim home alive. After that critical period passes, the chances of finding the victim alive drop dramatically, falling from roughly 70% to less than 30% with each passing day. I assembled my team immediately, calling in the best detectives I knew. Detective Lisa Park, my partner of 8 years, who had an uncanny ability to read people and spot lies from across a room, and Detective Tony Morales from the Major Crimes Unit, a former Marine with experience in hostage situations and tactical operations. We set up a command center at the precinct, transforming conference room B into a war room with whiteboards covered in timelines, suspect photos, and maps of the crime scene area. The coffee machine worked overtime as we began working the case, from every conceivable angle, knowing that somewhere out there, Marcus Thompson was counting on us to find him before it was too late. The kidnappers had been smart, demonstrating a level of planning and professionalism that immediately set this case apart from the typical crimes of opportunity we usually dealt with. They had chosen a location with minimal camera coverage, timing, their operation for the brief window when the security guard was making his rounds inside. The building and the street was relatively empty of pedestrians. The execution of the grab showed military precision, with each perpetrator playing a specific role in what appeared to be a well-rehearsed operation. We pulled footage from every camera within a 6-block radius, spending hours reviewing grainy, black and white images, looking for any detail that might give us a lead. We interviewed potential witnesses, canvassed the neighborhood, and started building a comprehensive timeline of Marcus's last known movements. His secretary confirmed he had left the office at his usual time, around 9:15 p.m., after finishing a conference call with clients in Tokyo. The building's security guard remembered seeing him in the lobby, checking his phone and looking slightly preoccupied, but nothing that seemed unusual or alarming. Marcus Thompson's life appeared clean on the surface, almost suspiciously so. No gambling debts that we could find, no known enemies in his professional or personal life, no obvious motive for someone to target him specifically. His bank accounts showed regular activity, nothing suspicious or out of the ordinary for someone in his income bracket. His investment firm had a solid reputation, and his clients spoke highly of his integrity and professionalism. His wife, Jennifer, provided us with a comprehensive list of his associates, business partners, clients, and friends, and we started running detailed background checks on everyone, looking for any connection that might explain why someone would want to harm Marcus Thompson. The waiting game began, that terrible period in a kidnapping case, when you've done everything you can do and now you have to wait for the perpetrators to make their next move. In kidnapping cases, the perpetrators usually make contact within the first 24 hours if they want ransom money, but as the hours ticked by with no word from the kidnappers, I started to worry this wasn't about money at all, which would make it infinitely more dangerous for Marcus Thompson. Asterisk at exactly to 17 a.m. on the second day, 46 hours after Marcus Thompson had vanished into that black SUV, the call finally came. Jennifer's phone lit up with an unknown number, and we were ready, our tech team positioned with tracing equipment and recording devices. The voice that came through the speaker was electronically distorted, run through some kind of voice modulation, software that made it impossible to determine gender, age, or any identifying characteristics. "Mrs. Thompson," the voice said, cold and mechanical, devoid of any human emotion. "Your husband is alive, but that can change very quickly if you don't follow our instructions exactly as we give them to you." The caller demanded $2 million in untraceable cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, to be transferred within 24 hours to wallet addresses they would provide. They would send detailed transfer instructions via an encrypted messaging app that Jennifer would need to download immediately. Any contact with law enforcement would result in Marcus's immediate execution. They warned, and they claimed to have people watching the Thompson apartment who would know if police were involved. Of course, Jennifer had already contacted us, but the kidnappers didn't need to know that detail. We had coached her extensively on how to handle this conversation. keeping her calm and focused while our tech team worked frantically to trace the call and gather any electronic intelligence they could from the brief contact. The call lasted exactly 90 seconds before the line went dead, leaving us with more questions than answers. Our trace came up empty, as we had expected it would. These weren't amateur criminals using burner phones from convenience stores. They were using sophisticated voice-over IP technology, bouncing their signal through multiple international servers in countries with limited cooperation with US law enforcement. The level of technical sophistication suggested we were dealing with experienced players, possibly with military intelligence or law enforcement backgrounds. Detective Park and I exchanged glances across the command center, both of us thinking the same thing. The professionalism of this operation, from the initial kidnapping to the ransom demand, suggested we were dealing with people who had done this before and knew how to avoid the typical mistakes that get criminals caught. The demand for cryptocurrency, instead of traditional cash, showed they understood modern financial tracking methods and were taking steps to avoid detection. We had 24 hours to find Marcus Thompson before the kidnappers potentially carried out their threat, and we were no closer to identifying them than we had been when this nightmare began. Our cybercrime unit, led by Detective Sam Williams, a former NSA analyst who had joined the NYPD 5 years earlier, dove deep into the digital evidence with the intensity of archaeologists uncovering ancient artifacts. The encrypted messaging app the kidnappers had specified was Signal, popular among privacy-conscious users, journalists, activists, and, unfortunately, criminals who needed secure communications, while the messages themselves were protected by end-to-end encryption that even the app developers couldn't break. Metadata could still provide valuable clues about timing, general geographic location, device information, and usage patterns that might help us identify our suspects. Meanwhile, we worked closely with Jennifer to prepare for the ransom transfer, walking a careful line between appearing to comply with the kidnappers' demands while buying ourselves precious time to track the money trail and hopefully identify the perpetrators. Jennifer had access to the required funds through Marcus's investment accounts and their joint savings, but liquidating that amount of money and converting it to cryptocurrency would normally take several days, giving us a legitimate reason to request an extension from the kidnappers. Our plan was to delay the transfer as long as possible while appearing to make good faith efforts to meet their demands. We also reached out to federal agencies for assistance, knowing that kidnapping cases often cross state lines and require resources beyond what local police departments can provide. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico provided a preliminary profile of our suspects based on the evidence we had gathered so far. They described our perpetrators as likely being a small, highly organized group with significant technical expertise, possibly motivated by financial gain but potentially harboring personal grudges against the victim that went beyond simple monetary considerations. The use of electronic voice distortion, sophisticated communication methods, and cryptocurrency demands suggested a high level of paranoia about identification and capture, indicating these were not first-time offenders. As we dug deeper into Marcus Thompson's background, peeling back the layers of his seemingly perfect life like an onion, we discovered he wasn't quite the clean-cut businessman he appeared to be on the surface. His investment firm, Sterling & Associates, had been investigated 3 years earlier by the Securities and Exchange Commission for potential securities fraud related to higher-risk investments that had cost several clients their life savings. While no criminal charges were ultimately filed, the investigation had generated significant negative publicity and created a pool of disgruntled former clients who had lost substantial amounts of money in failed investments, creating a potential list of suspects with clear financial motives for revenge against Marcus Thompson. Asterisk on the third day of the investigation. While Marcus Thompson remained missing and our leads seemed to be drying up one by one, Detective Morales made a discovery that would change the entire direction of our case. While meticulously reviewing Marcus Thompson's phone records, going through months of call logs with the patience of a monk copying manuscripts, he noticed a pattern of calls to a number that wasn't listed among the contacts Jennifer had provided during her initial interview. The number appeared frequently in Marcus's call history, often late at night or during lunch hours, with conversations lasting anywhere from 15 minutes to over an hour. When we ran the number through our databases, it came back registered to a woman named Sofia Martinez, 28 years old, who worked as a real estate agent for a small firm in Brooklyn, specializing in luxury apartments and condominiums. When we ran her background check through our criminal databases, we found something that immediately caught our attention. Sofia had a criminal record, though it was relatively minor. 2 arrests for fraud in her early 20s, both related. 2 credit card scams that had netted her a few $1,000s each time. She had served only probation for both offenses, but more importantly for our investigation, she had connections to known criminals in the city's underground network. People who moved in circles where kidnapping for ransom wouldn't be considered beyond the pale. Detective Park and I decided to pay Sofia Martinez a visit at her apartment in Park Slope, a trendy Brooklyn neighborhood that had gentrified significantly over the past decade. Her building was a converted brownstone with a small real estate office on the ground floor and residential apartments above. When we climbed the narrow stairs to her third-floor apartment and knocked on the door, we could hear movement inside, the sound of someone moving quickly around the apartment as if trying to hide something. When she finally answered the door, I could see the fear in her eyes before she even knew why we were there. That unmistakable look of someone who has been expecting bad news and finally sees it arriving at their doorstep. Sofia Martinez, NYPD. We'd like to ask you some questions about Marcus Thompson. Her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks like water from a broken dam, and she invited us in without protest, her hands visibly shaking as she gestured toward the living room. The apartment was modest but well-maintained, decorated, with an eye for style that probably came from her work in real estate. But I noticed several details that seemed out of place for someone living on a real estate agent's salary. There was expensive artwork on the walls, designer furniture that looked like it belonged in a much more expensive apartment, and, most tellingly, a men's Rolex watch sitting on the coffee table that looked expensive enough to belong to a successful investment banker. Sofia Martinez broke down within an hour of questioning, her carefully constructed facade crumbling like a house of cards in a strong wind. The tears came first, then the confession, spilling out of her in a torrent of words mixed with sobs and desperate attempts to explain how she had gotten involved in what she was beginning to realize was a much more serious situation than she had initially understood. The affair had been going on for 8 months, she admitted through tears that left mascara streaks down her cheeks. It had started innocently enough, she claimed, when Marcus had contacted her about finding an apartment for a business associate. They had met for coffee to discuss his requirements, and there had been an immediate attraction that both of them had tried to ignore but ultimately couldn't resist. Marcus had promised to leave his wife, had given her expensive gifts, including the jewelry she was wearing and the watch we had noticed, and had even discussed setting her up in a better apartment. in Manhattan, where they could spend more time together without worrying about being discovered by his wife or business associates. But recently, over the past month, he had been pulling away, cancelling their regular meetings, avoiding her calls, and talking more frequently about ending their relationship to focus on his family and his career. He said it was getting too complicated, Sophia sobbed, her voice breaking with each word. That his wife was getting suspicious because she had found some credit card statements with charges from restaurants we had been to together, and he couldn't risk his reputation or his kid's future for what he called a temporary indiscretion. The betrayal in her voice was palpable, the pain of a woman who had believed she was loved and had discovered she was merely a convenient distraction. I had seen enough domestic cases over the years to know that hurt feelings and romantic betrayal alone don't usually lead to kidnapping, but they can certainly provide the emotional fuel for more serious crimes when combined with other factors. There had to be more to this story, more players involved, and more complex motivations than simple romantic revenge. Detective Park pressed her about the timing of these conversations, trying to establish a clear timeline that might help us understand how the kidnapping fit into the broader pattern of Marcus's relationship troubles. When exactly did Marcus say he wanted to end things between you? Park asked, her voice gentle but insistent. 2 weeks ago, Sophia replied, wiping her eyes with a tissue that was already soaked with tears. Right after his wife found one of his credit card statements with charges from restaurants we had been to together. He panicked, said he needed to be more careful, that he couldn't afford to have his marriage fall apart right now because of some business deals he was working on that required his wife's trust and support. This timeline was crucial to our investigation because the kidnapping had occurred just days after Marcus had apparently decided to end the affair, suggesting a possible connection between his decision to break things off with Sophia and his subsequent disappearance. But Sophia seemed genuinely distraught about Marcus's disappearance, and her alibi for the night of the kidnapping checked out when we verified it. She had been working late that Tuesday evening, showing an apartment to potential buyers in Brooklyn Heights, with multiple witnesses present, including the building's doorman and the prospective tenants who had signed a lease application that night. As we dug deeper into Sophia's background, conducting the kind of thorough investigation that leaves no stone unturned, we discovered she had a brother, Carlos Martinez, with a much more extensive and violent criminal record that immediately raised red flags for our investigation. Carlos was 34 years old, 6 years older than Sophia, and had served significant time in state prison for armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy charges related to a drug trafficking operation that had been broken up by federal agents 3 years earlier. More concerning for our current case, Carlos had known associations with organized crime figures in the city, people who specialized in kidnapping, extortion, and other violent crimes for profit. When we brought Sophia back to the precinct for a second, more intensive interview, this time in one of our formal interrogation rooms with cameras recording every word, she finally revealed the truth about her brother's involvement in the situation. The interview room was small and windowless, designed to make suspects feel isolated and encourage them to talk. And after several hours of patient questioning, Sophia's resistance finally crumbled completely. Carlos was furious when I told him about Marcus ending things, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He said Marcus had used me, that rich guys like him think they can just throw away people like us when they're done playing their games and want to go back to their perfect little lives. Carlos had approached Sophia with a plan that was both revenge and an attempt to force Marcus to make a choice about their relationship. If Marcus wouldn't leave his wife voluntarily, Carlos reasoned, they would create a situation where he would have to choose between his comfortable life and Sophia's safety. The kidnapping wasn't primarily about ransom money, though that was certainly part of the plan. It was about revenge, control, and forcing Marcus Thompson to confront the consequences of what Carlos saw as his callous treatment of Sophia. Carlos believed that if Marcus feared for his life, if he was forced to confront his own mortality and the reality that his actions had consequences, he would realize how much Sophia meant to him and would finally leave his wife to be with her. The ransom demand was secondary, a way to make the crime appear financially motivated while masking the personal vendetta that was really driving the operation. Sophia had provided Carlos with crucial inside information that made the kidnapping possible. Marcus's daily schedule, his usual routes between home and office, details about his security habits, and most importantly, the timing of when he would be most vulnerable to attack. She had been the inside source that allowed Carlos and his associates to plan and execute the kidnapping with such precision. Though she claimed repeatedly that she never thought Carlos would actually hurt Marcus, that she believed it would just be a scare tactic to make him appreciate what he was losing. Asterisk with Sophia's confession providing us with our primary suspect. We immediately shifted our focus to finding Carlos Martinez, but he had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. His last known address was a run-down apartment in a rough section of Queens, a fourth-floor walk-up in a building that had seen better decades. But when we raided it with a full tactical team, we found it had been abandoned for weeks. The apartment was empty except for some basic furniture and the kind of debris that accumulates when someone leaves in a hurry. His neighbors, a mix of working families and people who minded their own business as a matter of survival, reported seeing him loading boxes and bags into a van about 10 days earlier, right around the time Marcus had told Sophia he wanted to end their affair. This timing suggested that Carlos had been planning this operation for longer than we initially realized, that he had been preparing for the kidnapping even before Marcus had made his final decision to break things off with Sophia. We put out a bolo alert for Carlos Martinez, distributing his photo and description to every police department in the tri-state area, and began the painstaking process of tracking down his known associates. His criminal network included several individuals with the technical skills necessary for the sophisticated communication methods the kidnappers had used, as well as people with experience in planning and executing violent crimes. One name that kept coming up in our investigation was Vincent Vinny Russo, a former military communications specialist who had been dishonorably discharged from the army after being caught selling weapons to civilian buyers. Since his discharge, Russo had made a living providing technical services to criminal organizations, everything from encrypted communications to electronic surveillance and counter-surveillance equipment. Detective Williams, our cybercrime specialist, managed to trace the encrypted messages back to a server farm in New Jersey, a massive facility that housed thousands of computer servers for various legitimate businesses and organizations. However, the trail went cold there because the servers were accessed through multiple layers of proxy connections that made it nearly impossible to determine the actual location of the users. However, security footage from the facility showed a man matching Carlos Martinez's description entering the building 3 days before the kidnapping, accompanied by another individual who fit Vincent Russo's physical description. We were getting closer to our suspects, but Marcus Thompson had now been missing for 4 days, and we still didn't know where he was being held, or whether he was even still alive. Asterisk. The breakthrough in our case came from an unexpected source that reminded me why good police work often depends as much on luck and community cooperation as it does on sophisticated investigative techniques. Sophia's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old retired teacher who had lived in the same Park Slope apartment for 40 years, had been following the news coverage of the kidnapping with the kind of attention that only comes from having too much time and a genuine concern for her community. She recognized Marcus's photo from the television reports and called our tip line to report that she had seen him leaving Sophia's apartment building several times over the past few months, always late at night and always looking around nervously as if he was worried about being seen. But more importantly for our investigation, Mrs. Chen had overheard Sophia arguing with someone on the phone about the place upstate, just days before the kidnapping occurred. The conversation had been loud enough for Mrs. Chen to hear through the thin walls of the old building, and she remembered Sophia saying something about making sure it was ready and nobody would find us there. When we confronted Sophia with this information during a follow-up interview, she finally gave us the location we had been desperately searching for, a remote cabin in the Catskill Mountains, about 2 hours north of New York City, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest for several miles. The property had been in the Martinez family for 3 generations, inherited from their grandmother who had bought it as a summer retreat back in the 1960s when the area was still largely undeveloped. Carlos knew the property intimately, having spent summers there as a child, and it was the perfect place to hold someone without fear of discovery by law enforcement or curious neighbors. The cabin was completely isolated, surrounded by hundreds of acres of state forest land, with the nearest neighbor more than 5 miles away. There was no cell phone coverage in the area, no internet access, and the only way in or out was the single dirt road that could easily be monitored for approaching vehicles. We assembled a tactical team and began preparing for what we hoped would be a rescue operation, but we knew we were walking into a potentially deadly situation. The cabin's isolation meant that if Carlos and his accomplices were there, they would see us coming from a mile away, giving them plenty of time to harm Marcus or prepare for a siege. We needed to approach the situation carefully to avoid triggering a hostage situation that could end with Marcus Thompson's death and potentially the deaths of our own officers. At dawn on the 5th day of Marcus Thompson's captivity, our tactical team moved into position around the cabin like pieces on a chessboard, each officer knowing their role in what we hoped would be a successful rescue operation. The morning mist hung low over the mountains, providing some natural cover for our approach, but also limiting visibility and making the operation more dangerous for everyone involved. We had spent hours studying satellite images of the property, identifying potential approach routes, escape paths, and defensive positions that the kidnappers might use if they decided to make a stand. Thermal imaging from a police helicopter circling at high altitude confirmed the presence of at least 4 individuals inside the structure, their body heat signatures showing up as bright spots against the cooler background of the building. One figure appeared to be restrained in what looked like a basement area, presumably Marcus Thompson, while the other 3 were moving freely throughout the building, suggesting they were his captors. We established a perimeter around the cabin, positioning officers with sniper rifles at strategic points that would give them clear shots at the building's windows and exits. Our tactical commander, Sergeant Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran with extensive experience in hostage situations, coordinated the operation from a command post we had established about half a mile from the cabin, far enough away to avoid detection but close enough to maintain communication with all team members. Using a bullhorn, I identified myself as a police detective and called for the occupants to release their hostage and surrender peacefully, offering them the opportunity to end this situation without anyone getting hurt. This is Detective Rodriguez, NYPD. We have the building surrounded. Release Marcus Thompson and come out with your hands visible, and nobody needs to get hurt today. The response was immediate and violent, shattering the morning quiet like a thunderclap. Gunfire erupted from multiple windows of the cabin, muzzle flashes visible in the dim morning light as bullets whined through the air around our positions. Our officers took cover behind trees, tactical vehicles, and the natural terrain features of the mountainous landscape. The gunfire was disciplined and accurate, not the wild shooting of desperate amateurs, but the controlled fire of people who knew how to handle weapons under pressure and had experience in combat situations. We were clearly dealing with Carlos, Martinez, Vincent Russo, and at least one other accomplice who had military or law enforcement training and knew how to conduct defensive operations. For 3 hours, we maintained the standoff while our negotiator, Detective Rachel Adams, a specialist in crisis communication who had successfully resolved dozens of hostage situations over her career, attempted to establish meaningful communication with the kidnappers. The kidnappers had barricaded themselves inside the cabin and showed no interest in negotiating, responding to our attempts at communication with sporadic gunfire that kept our officers pinned down and prevented us from advancing on the building. They clearly had supplies, weapons, and a hostage who gave them significant leverage in any negotiation. Time was working against us because the longer the situation continued, the more likely it became that someone would be seriously injured or killed, and we needed to find a way to end this standoff before it escalated further. Detective Adams finally managed to make meaningful contact with Carlos Martinez through a cell phone we had identified as belonging to one of the kidnappers, using our technical equipment to boost the weak signal that barely reached the remote location. Carlos was angry, desperate, and increasingly unstable, his voice cracking with emotion as he screamed into the phone about the injustices he felt had been done to his sister and his family. "This is all his fault," he yelled, his words echoing through the speaker in our command post. "He used my sister, made her believe he loved her, then threw her away like garbage when he got bored. Rich bastards like him think they own the world, think they can use people and throw them away without any consequences." Adams worked patiently to establish rapport with Carlos, acknowledging his anger and frustration while trying to de-escalate the situation and find common ground that might lead to a peaceful resolution. "I understand you feel betrayed, Carlos. Marcus hurt Sophia, and that hurt you too because you love your sister and want to protect her. But killing him won't fix anything. It'll just destroy more lives, including yours and Sophia's. She needs you alive and free, not dead or in prison, for the rest of your life." The conversation revealed the depth of Carlos's resentment toward what he saw as the privileged class, people who had advantages he had never enjoyed and who seemed to live by different rules than everyone else. Marcus Thompson represented everything Carlos felt was wrong with American society: wealth, power, education, and the ability to use people without facing any meaningful consequences for their actions. This wasn't just about his sister's broken heart or even about the money they hoped to get from the ransom. It was about years of accumulated rage against a system he felt had failed him and his family. A system that rewarded people like Marcus Thompson while punishing people like Carlos Martinez for trying to get ahead by any means necessary. During the lengthy negotiation, which stretched on for hours as Adams patiently worked to build trust and find a peaceful solution, we learned that Marcus was alive but injured. He had been beaten during the initial kidnapping when he tried to resist his captors and had received only minimal medical attention for his injuries. Carlos claimed he would release Marcus in exchange for safe passage out of the country and a guarantee that Sophia wouldn't be prosecuted for her role in providing information that made the kidnapping possible. But we knew that wasn't going to happen under any circumstances. As negotiations stalled and it became clear that Carlos Martinez was not going to surrender peacefully, our tactical commander made the difficult decision to breach the cabin and attempt a rescue operation. The decision wasn't made lightly, as we knew that any assault on the building carried significant risks for Marcus Thompson's safety. But we also knew that the longer the situation continued, the more unstable Carlos was becoming, and the greater the risk that he would harm or kill his hostage out of desperation or rage, using flashbang grenades to disorient the defenders and smoke grenades to obscure their vision. The SWAT team entered the cabin through multiple entry points simultaneously in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the kidnappers before they could react effectively. The assault was swift and violent, with officers moving through the building room by room, clearing each area methodically while maintaining constant communication with the command post. Vincent Russo was taken down in the main room of the cabin, wounded by gunfire but alive and conscious when officers reached him. A third accomplice, later identified as Tommy Valdez, another of Carlos's criminal associates with a history of violent crime, surrendered immediately when faced with armed officers pointing weapons at him, dropping his gun and raising his hands without resistance. But Carlos Martinez, driven by desperation and the knowledge that he was facing life in prison if captured, made a desperate last stand in the basement where Marcus Thompson was being held captive. When officers reached the basement, they found Carlos holding a pistol to Marcus's head, the investment banker bound to a chair with rope and duct tape, clearly beaten and dehydrated, but conscious and aware of what was happening around him. "Stay back or I'll kill him," Carlos shouted, his voice cracking with desperation and exhaustion. "I swear to God, I'll blow his brains out if you come any closer." Officer Jennifer Walsh, our best marksman and a former military sniper with combat experience in Afghanistan, had positioned herself at the top of the basement stairs with a clear line of sight to Carlos. But the angle was difficult and dangerous, with Marcus so close to the gunman. For several tense minutes that felt like hours, Detective Adams continued negotiating through the basement door, while our tactical team positioned themselves for a clean shot if the opportunity presented itself. The standoff finally ended when Carlos, overwhelmed by the hopelessness of his situation and realizing he had no escape route and no leverage left, finally surrendered his weapon and collapsed in tears, the fight going out of him all at once like air from a punctured balloon. Marcus Thompson was immediately rushed to the nearest hospital, which was nearly an hour away through winding mountain roads, where emergency room doctors treated him for severe dehydration, multiple contusions and bruises covering most of his body, a broken rib that had been causing him significant pain, and various cuts and abrasions from his ordeal. Physically, the doctors assured us he would recover completely within a few weeks, but the psychological trauma of being kidnapped, beaten, and held captive for 5 days would take much longer to heal and would require extensive counseling and therapy. Carlos Martinez, Vincent Russo, and Tommy Valdez were all arrested and charged with kidnapping, assault, weapons, violations, and conspiracy, while Sofia Martinez was arrested as an accessory to kidnapping for her role in providing the information. that made the crime possible. During the extensive post-arrest interviews that followed, conducted over several days as we worked to understand every detail of the plot and identify any other potential accomplices, more details of the conspiracy emerged. Carlos had originally planned to kill Marcus after receiving the ransom money, viewing his death as the ultimate revenge for his treatment of Sofia. But Sofia had convinced him that Marcus's death would only bring more police attention and wouldn't solve anything for their family. The plan had evolved into holding Marcus for several days, collecting the ransom money to fund their escape from the country, then releasing him with a warning to treat Sofia better in the future and a threat of death if he ever contacted her again. The sophisticated communication methods and careful planning suggested this wasn't Carlos's first major crime, though it would certainly be his last as a free man. Vincent Russo admitted to providing the technical expertise that made the operation possible, including the encrypted communications, voice distortion software, and electronic surveillance equipment they had used to monitor police activities. Tommy Valdez had been recruited primarily as muscle for the kidnapping itself and to help guard Marcus during his captivity. Though he claimed he had been told it would just be a simple kidnapping for ransom and that nobody would be seriously hurt. The investigation also revealed that Carlos had been planning some kind of action against Marcus for weeks before the actual kidnapping occurred, gathering information about his daily routines, his security habits, and his personal relationships. Through Sofia and through his own surveillance activities. The trial of Carlos Martinez and his accomplices began 6 months later in Manhattan Criminal Court, drawing significant media attention due to the dramatic nature of the crime and the complex personal relationships that had motivated it. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos, a veteran prosecutor with extensive experience in major felony cases, painted a picture of a carefully planned crime motivated by a toxic combination of revenge, greed, and class resentment. The evidence against the defendants was overwhelming and included Sofia's detailed testimony about her brother's involvement, security footage from various locations, digital communications recovered from their devices, physical evidence from the cabin where Marcus had been held, and Marcus's own testimony about his ordeal. Carlos Martinez's defense attorney, a public defender named Robert Chen, who had drawn the unenviable task of defending an obviously guilty client, argued that his client had been driven to desperation by his sister's emotional pain and his own difficult circumstances growing up in poverty while watching wealthy people like Marcus Thompson live lives of privilege and luxury. The defense portrayed Carlos as a man who had made terrible choices but wasn't inherently evil, someone who had been pushed to the breaking point by a system that favored the wealthy and powerful while leaving people like him behind. The jury, composed of 12 citizens from diverse backgrounds who had listened to weeks of testimony and evidence, wasn't swayed by this argument. After deliberating for just 4 hours, they returned guilty verdicts on all major charges against all 3 defendants. Carlos Martinez was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and his role as the leader of the conspiracy. Vincent Russo received 15 years for his role in providing technical support and weapons, while Tommy Valdez, who had cooperated with prosecutors and had no prior violent offenses on his record, received 8 years with the possibility of parole after serving 5. Sofia Martinez had pled guilty to conspiracy charges before the trial began and was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. Her cooperation with the investigation and her genuine remorse for her role in the crime were significant factors in her reduced sentence, though the judge made it clear that her actions had enabled a serious, violent crime that could have resulted in Marcus Thompson's death. The case took a devastating toll on everyone involved, but perhaps no one suffered more than the Thompson family, whose lives were completely shattered by the revelation of Marcus's affair and the violent crime it had ultimately led to. Marcus's marriage to Jennifer couldn't survive the double betrayal of his adultery and the fact that his personal choices had put their entire family at risk of violence and tragedy. The trust that had been broken went far beyond the simple fact of his affair with Sophia. Jennifer felt betrayed that Marcus's selfish decisions had endangered not just himself, but potentially their children as well, and she couldn't forgive him for bringing that kind of danger into their lives. They divorced 8 months after the kidnapping, though they maintained a civil relationship for the sake of their 2 children, who were struggling to understand how their father's actions had led to such terrible consequences. Marcus Thompson left his prestigious position at Sterling and Associates and moved to California, where he started a new career in financial consulting, working with smaller clients and trying to rebuild his life away from the memories and publicity that surrounded the case in New York. He underwent extensive therapy to deal with both the trauma of his kidnapping and the guilt he felt about his role in creating the situation that led to it. In our final interview before he left New York, Marcus told me he had learned that actions have consequences that extend far beyond what we can imagine when we make our choices. I thought I could compartmentalize my life, he said, his voice heavy with regret. Keep my affairs separate from my family, my work, everything else. But life doesn't work that way. Everything is connected, and when you hurt people, that pain spreads in ways you never expect and can never fully control. Sophia Martinez served her full 3-year sentence in a women's correctional facility upstate, where she earned her college degree through a prison education program and worked in the library helping other inmates with their legal research. When she was released, she moved to Oregon and changed her name, trying to build a new life away from the memories of her relationship with Marcus and the crime that had destroyed so many lives. She found work as a teacher's aide in a small school district and has remained out of trouble with the law, though she still struggles with the guilt and shame of her role in the kidnapping. This case taught me several important lessons about human nature, criminal behavior, and police work that have stayed with me throughout the remainder of my career. First, personal relationships can be the most dangerous motivator for crime, more dangerous in many ways than simple greed or desperation. Carlos Martinez wasn't driven primarily by the desire for money, though that was certainly part of his motivation. He was driven by love for his sister and rage at what he perceived as injustice, and that emotional investment made him more dangerous and unpredictable than a typical kidnapper, who was motivated solely by financial gain. When criminals have emotional stakes in the outcome of their crimes, they're more likely to take extreme risks and less likely to make rational decisions that might lead to peaceful resolutions. Second, the sophistication of modern criminals continues to evolve at a pace that sometimes outstrips law enforcement's ability to keep up. The use of encrypted communications, cryptocurrency, voice distortion technology, and advanced surveillance countermeasures showed that today's criminals are adapting quickly to law enforcement techniques and are often more technologically sophisticated than the officers trying to catch them. We had to constantly update our own methods and equipment to stay ahead of the criminals we were pursuing. And even then, we often felt like we were playing catch-up rather than staying ahead of the curve. Third, this case reinforced the importance of following every lead. no matter how small or seemingly insignificant it might appear at first glance. The phone records that revealed Marcus's affair with Sophia seemed like a minor detail when we first discovered them, but they proved to be the key to solving the entire case and finding Marcus before his captors killed him. In police work, you never know which piece of information will be the one that breaks the case wide open, so you have to pursue every lead with the same level of intensity and attention to detail. Finally, this case reinforced my belief that crime always has victims beyond the immediate target, and that the consequences of criminal behavior ripple outward in ways that affect entire communities. Marcus Thompson was the primary victim of the kidnapping, but his wife, children, Sophia Carlos's family, and even the community as a whole all suffered consequences from the choices that led to that rainy night in October when three masked men forced a successful businessman into a black SUV and changed all of their lives forever. 5 years after the case closed and the headlines faded from the newspapers, I still occasionally think about the Thompson kidnapping and its lasting aftermath. The way the consequences of that crime continued to spread outward like ripples in a pond long after. Carlos Martinez was behind bars and the immediate crisis had passed. The ripple effects of that crime touched lives in ways that none of us could have predicted when we first got the call about a missing investment banker. Marcus Thompson's children, who were 12 and 14 at the time of the kidnapping, struggled for years with the knowledge that their father's affair had put their family in danger and had ultimately destroyed their parents' marriage. Both kids required extensive counseling to deal with the trauma, and their academic performance suffered significantly for several years as they tried to process what had happened to their family. The older child, Marcus Jr., developed anxiety, issues that required medication and therapy, while his younger sister Emma became withdrawn and had difficulty trusting adults. Jennifer Thompson eventually remarried 3 years after her divorce from Marcus, but she told me in a chance encounter at a coffee shop that she still had trust issues and anxiety about her new husband's business trips, always worrying that he might be hiding something that could put their family at risk. The case also had a significant impact on our department's procedures and training protocols. We updated our standard operating procedures for handling kidnapping cases involving personal relationships, recognizing that domestic situations can escalate into major crimes more quickly and unpredictably than traditional kidnappings motivated solely by financial gain. We also improved our coordination with cybercrime units and federal agencies, acknowledging that modern criminals increasingly rely on sophisticated technology to plan and execute their crimes, and that local police departments need better resources and training to keep up with these evolving threats. Detective Park and I were both commended for our work on the case and received departmental awards for our successful resolution of a complex investigation, but the recognition felt hollow, given the human cost of the crime and the lives that had been permanently damaged by the events we had investigated. Yes, we had saved Marcus Thompson's life and brought his kidnappers to justice, but we couldn't undo the damage to his family or prevent the years of pain and suffering that followed in the wake of the crime. In preparing this detailed account of the Thompson kidnapping case, I reached out to Sophia Martinez, who agreed to speak with me about the case from her current perspective. 5 years after her release from prison and her attempt to build a new life in Oregon, now 33 years old and working as a teacher's aide in a small school district under her new legal name, she expressed deep regret about her role in the kidnapping and the pain it had caused to so many people. I was so angry and hurt that I couldn't think clearly about what I was doing, she told me during our lengthy phone conversation. I knew Carlos was planning something to get back at Marcus, but I convinced myself it would just be a scare tactic, something to make him realize how much I meant to him. I never imagined it would go as far as it did, that people would get hurt the way they did. Sophia revealed something during our conversation that she hadn't told us during the original investigation. A detail that added another layer of tragedy to an already complex case. Marcus had actually been planning to leave his wife before the kidnapping occurred, she claimed. He had consulted with a divorce attorney and had been preparing to tell Jennifer about the affair and ask for a separation. He was going to choose me, Sophia said, her voice still carrying traces of the pain and loss from years ago. He had made the decision to leave Jennifer and try to build a life with me, but Carlos didn't believe him. Carlos thought Marcus was just stringing me along like he had been for months, making promises he never intended to keep. This revelation added yet another layer of tragedy to the case, suggesting that if Carlos had been patient for just a few more weeks, Marcus might have left his wife voluntarily, and the kidnapping never would have happened. Instead, his impatience and distrust, combined with his anger at what he saw as Marcus's mistreatment of his sister, led to a crime that destroyed multiple lives and sent him to prison for decades. Sophia also told me that she had tried to contact Marcus after her release from prison, wanting to apologize for her role in his kidnapping and the destruction of his family, but he had refused to speak with her, which she said she understood and respected. As I near retirement after 35 years in law enforcement, having worked hundreds of cases ranging from simple burglaries to complex homicides, the Thompson kidnapping case remains one of the most morally and emotionally complex investigations I've ever been involved in. It challenges simple notions of good and evil, victim and perpetrator, justice and revenge in ways that continue to make me think about the nature of crime and punishment. Years after the case was officially closed, Marcus Thompson was certainly a victim of a violent crime, kidnapped and held against his will by people who threatened to kill him. But his affair with Sofia Martinez created the conditions that led directly to his own kidnapping. He was both victim and catalyst, someone who suffered terribly but whose own choices set in motion the events that led to his suffering. Sofia Martinez was manipulated by her brother and used by her lover. A woman who believed she was in love and was ultimately betrayed by both the men in her life. But she also provided crucial information that made the crime possible and enabled her brother to plan and execute the kidnapping. Carlos Martinez was a criminal who planned and executed a serious felony that could have resulted in murder. But he was also a brother trying to protect his sister from what he saw as emotional abuse and exploitation by a wealthy man who thought he could use people without consequences. These moral complexities don't excuse the crimes that were committed or diminish the suffering of the victims, but they do illustrate how personal relationships can spiral into violence when people feel they have no other options for addressing what they perceive as injustices. The justice system handled the case appropriately from a legal standpoint. The kidnappers were punished according to their level of involvement in the crime, and Marcus Thompson received the protection and justice he deserved as a victim. But justice in the legal sense doesn't always translate to healing for the people involved, and the scars from this case will last much longer than any prison sentence. In my experience, the most dangerous criminals are often those who believe they're fighting for something righteous, even when their methods are clearly wrong, and their actions cause more harm than the problems they're trying to solve. Asterisk today, as I write this final chapter of my account of the Thompson kidnapping case, Carlos Martinez is still serving his sentence in a maximum security prison upstate, where, according to corrections officials, he has been a model prisoner for the past 5 years. He earned his GED during his first year in prison and has since completed several vocational training programs, including computer repair and automotive maintenance. He works in the prison library, helping other inmates with their legal research and education programs, and has expressed genuine remorse for his actions in letters he has written to Marcus Thompson, though Marcus has chosen not to respond to any of these communications. Carlos will be eligible for parole in 2045, when he's 68 years old, assuming he continues to maintain his exemplary prison record and completes all required rehabilitation programs. Vincent Russo was released after serving 12 years of his 15-year sentence, having earned early release for good behavior and his cooperation with authorities in several other investigations involving cybercrime and organized criminal activities. He now works as a computer technician for a small business in New Jersey, using his military training and technical skills for legitimate purposes. He's married to a woman he met through a pen pal program while in prison, has 2 young children, and by all accounts has successfully reintegrated into society and left his criminal past behind. Tommy Valdez served his full 8-year sentence and was released in 2028. He struggled initially with finding employment due to his criminal record and the stigma associated with his involvement in such a high-profile case, but eventually found work in construction through a program that helps former inmates transition back into society. He's remained clean and sober since his release and has become an advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking to young people in schools and community centers about the consequences of criminal behavior and the importance of making better choices than he did. The Thompson kidnapping case taught me that police work is about much more than just catching criminals and solving crimes. Though those are certainly important parts of the job, it's about understanding the complex human motivations that drive people to make terrible choices and trying to prevent those situations from escalating into violence whenever possible. Sometimes we succeed in preventing crimes before they happen, and sometimes we don't. But every case teaches us something valuable about human nature and helps us become better at protecting and serving our communities. This case will always remind me that behind every crime statistic is a human story filled with pain, poor choices, broken relationships, and consequences that extend far beyond what anyone initially imagined when they made their first bad decision. As police officers, we see the aftermath of these decisions every day, and our job is to seek justice for the victims while trying to understand the complex web of relationships and motivations that led to the crime in the first place. The Thompson kidnapping was solved, the perpetrators were punished according to law, and the victim survived his ordeal, which in the end is what we call a successful case in law enforcement. But success in police work often comes with a heavy price, paid by everyone involved. And the true measure of our success isn't just in the crimes we solve, but in the lives we're able to protect and the communities we're able to keep safe. Asterisk.